The panel today is going to feature Emmanuel Ottolenghi, the Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense for Democracies, and of course Eric Farnsworth, the Vice President of the Council of the Americas. I welcome the opportunity to have them testify here today. I also want to thank all of you who are here and in attendance. At this hearing, it's my hope that we can examine external political and economic influences on our hemisphere from traditional state actors such as Russia and China, Iran, and North Korea. We'll also consider the potential terrorist threat posed by external terrorist groups such as ISIL, who are potentially radicalizing susceptible individuals in small countries throughout the hemisphere, and in particular the Caribbean. Some of these individuals are motivated to travel to join the fight in Syria and Iraq, and others may pose a risk for conducting attacks in their home countries or even seeking to enter the United States to do the same. Countering radicalization online within a small factor of the Muslim community and corresponding threat of homegrown violent extremism is perhaps one of the greatest challenges that we face in protecting innocent Americans at home from lone wolf terrorist attacks like those we've seen in Boston and San Bernardino and Orlando. The fact that this terrorist threat is spreading to other nations in our hemisphere should concern us all. For instance, Trinidad and Tobago is a prime example of a small Caribbean nation currently struggling with the threat of radicalization. According to a New York Times article from 21 February of this year, the Trinidadian government recently introduced a series of amendments that would criminalize membership in the Islamic State and other extremist organizations. That is an obvious legal reform that the United States must demand and hope to achieve from other countries in the hemisphere for the safety of their own citizens and our own. According to the New York Times, this new Trinidadian law would stipulate people who traveled to certain regions would be presumed to be doing so for terrorism. Trinidad has a population of just 1.3 million, but it had 130 of its citizens travel to Syria to fight for ISIL. The U.S., with 321 million people, has seen 250 citizens travel to join ISIL by comparison. And I want to hear from our witnesses about what the United States can do to work with Trinidad and other nations in the region struggling with these challenges. In particular, I want to hear what roles should the Department of State, Justice, Homeland Security, and Southern Command and the Defense Department be playing to reduce and confront radicalization. This hearing is also an opportunity to consider the continued illicit financial activities of Hezbollah, Iran, and other actors, enabled by some governments in the region with a history of anti-democratic postures. I also want to hear the current status of illicit financing and the financing of Hezbollah in particular. What is its posture in Latin America today? How are the activities of Hezbollah supported by travel from Iranian officials, particularly MOIS and the Quds Force? More broadly, it's important to examine how our adversaries in countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, through renewed diplomatic, military, and intelligence cooperation, are affecting our standing in the region. We'll also examine the links between external actors and the production of trafficking and selling of illegal drugs in the Western Hemisphere and the bankrolling of global terrorist activities. For instance, with a peace agreement in Colombia, how are Mexican transnational criminal organizations filling the void potentially left by the FARC? In 2014, I led in the Senate the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act of 2014 to prevent Hezbollah and associated entities from gaining access to international financial institutions. But there's more to be done, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. And with that, I turn it over to the ranking member, Senator Menendez. Unless any of the other members appear, we'll spend the next 20 minutes pretty much off the clock back and forth here on a dialogue and go from there. But Senator Menendez may need to go somewhere, but if he's here, I'll more than happy to jump in. Let me start. We have a lot of topics to cover. I want to start particularly with Venezuela because we talked a lot about outside actors. If you look at their financial situation, their debt service, which they have a real problem making, the financing, their ability to make those payments appears to be coming from three sources at this point. One is private banks, whether it's an investment bank or a broad multinational. And the hope there is that we can make and send a very clear message to these banks that they are active participants in funding repression when they conduct that sort of financial transaction. But the other are state actors, Russia and China. And I think both of these nations, despite their interests in creating a foothold in the hemisphere, also want to get paid. In essence, they want their money back. They don't view this as a gift. They view it as a loan that gives them influence, but they want their money back. particularly in the case of Russia, they can't afford to be making loans that don't get paid back. And in the case of China, I have found that nothing offends them more than the loss of face. And to basically be making bad loans that you don't get paid back in is a face-losing embarrassment. How would you advise members of the Senate and the Congress broader about articulating that message? Because here's the bottom line: China and Russia are lending the Maduro regime money that is never going to be paid back. They're never going to get that money back. And I understand that the hope of shaming them into not funding a repressive regime is, that standard's probably too high to meet in the case of Russia and China, but I do think they understand not getting paid back. And so how would you best argue to them, or what's the best strategy that you would advise us on moving forward to let both of those nations know that not only is this something that affects our bilateral relationship with them, but they're not going to get paid. I mean, these guys simply don't have the funds and the resources to pay them, and they're going to eventually going to default one way or the other, and they're going to get stuck with this bill.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a fundamental question that you've hit on, and this is why I keep saying that China's fundamental or primary interest in the Western Hemisphere is pragmatic. They want what they need to fuel their own economy. They're not that interested in the politics of the country in which they're engaged, so long as they're able to do business. Part of doing business is getting paid, obviously, just as you've articulated. And so from the perspective of an outside observer, I think, first of all, the United States, certainly the Senate, but also the executive branch, should be in an active dialogue right now with China. I've been urging this for a long time, that China has a huge interest in Venezuela for precisely the purposes you've said, and to bring China into the discussion of not just debt repayment, but what comes after the Maduro regime, because from my perspective, the best workout plan that you're going to be able to get for international creditors from Venezuela will be with an opposition that's in power, that's democratically elected and is sustainable and has the authority of the Venezuelan people to pay to meet its debts. Now, it's unclear whether they'll be able to meet all their debts. There may be a haircut that's required. Who knows? That's down the road. But from my perspective, I would work with the Chinese to say, look, let's work this out together, but the current path is unsustainable. So the earlier that we have free and fair elections in Venezuela, the earlier that we have the political prisoners released, the earlier that there's a sustainable government in place, the better prospects we together have for getting paid. Now, I think the Russian scenario is different, as we've discussed. I think they do have more of an interest in terms of the government in power, but they have also a different debt profile with reference to Venezuela, and it's less of the official loans, and it's more direct engagement in the energy sector. So, but to me, the most viable outcome for economic gain of debtors is a viable, democratically elected government in Venezuela, and we don't have that right now.
Doctor, do you have any?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an additional point to make with regard to Iran and Venezuela, rather. During the sanctions era, Iran used Venezuela as a money laundering place, as a place to evade sanctions. The entities that Iran created with Venezuela jointly for this purpose were delisted under the nuclear agreement. I think that gives us leverage because the Iranians do not have any desire to see entities relisted, and that is something that could be used as a threat to diminish their involvement. The second point I would make is that, of course, the Venezuelan regime has plundered its own national resources in partnership with Iran and others by using these tools, and it's also getting revenues by increasingly becoming involved with drug cartels. The revenues from those illicit activities that we have seen in the case of Vice President Aissami end up often in the financial system of the United States. So here you have additional leverage going after these assets, going after more individuals in the Venezuelan regime involved in this type of illicit activities on the side, going after entities that the Iranians have created, including joint ventures in the industrial sector, as sanctionable activities that support the Maduro regime and are complicit in the repression inside the country.
As an additional point on this topic, we're talking about external factors from outside the Western Hemisphere, but these are somehow interrelated also within the Western Hemisphere. In the case of Venezuela, one of the external actors within Venezuela is the government of Cuba, which has both provided sort of expertise and personnel on the intelligence, passport, internal security side, and also in all sorts of logistical support on intelligence and the like. One of the phenomena that has emerged from that is the so-called colectivos, or these citizen militias, for lack of a better term, who in many cases are well armed and sometimes actually undertaking much of the repression that's now going on. And I think there's a broader conversation to have about what happens down the road, even when those groups spin out of control. In essence, there will come a point where these groups establish, if they have not done so already, an independent character, independent of state control, so that Maduro can't even control them anymore or tell them. Even if he wanted to tell them to stop, he would not be able to, and you could foresee a conflict between these groups and, for example, the National Guard. But in the interim, when you have a bunch of well-armed individuals in the street, they also need to make a living. And when the Venezuelan government is no longer able to pay them to conduct repression, then what happens? Then these groups turn to illicit means. So you now have well-armed individuals who perhaps initially entered this for purposes of money and or ideology, who now understand how to use weapons, how to conduct violence, and are looking for a revenue source. And the experience of that in the hemisphere has been they turn to illicit activities such as drugs and trafficking and the like. And further complicating it is the possession of pretty sophisticated weaponry. You see multiple, for example, there's this Miami Herald article from the 24th of April of this year, which it talks about the Venezuelan government's decision to arm civilians to defend the country's socialist revolution is rekindling fears of terrorist and criminal organizations acquiring part of the nation's arsenal, which includes a large stockpile of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. And I would say that this, we may not view this as an external factor per se. It is something that an external actor, be it a transnational criminal group or an international terrorist organization looking to buy such weaponry, could take advantage of. And perhaps it's a topic that is unfair because it's an emerging topic and one that neither one of you perhaps has spent a tremendous amount of time on, but your initial impressions about whether that is something that is speculative or the existence of a large amount of weaponry in the hands of individuals looking to make a buck, isn't that always a recipe for disaster in terms of whether it's an outside actor coming in and buying them, or those groups using it to fund other activities within to conduct other sort activities within the region?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think that's an idle concern at all. I think that's a very real concern. In fact, it's precisely the phenomena we saw in Central America coming out of the civil wars in the 1980s and early 1990s. You had peace processes, you had peace accords, but you also had a number of generally young men with no marketable skills except the ability to pull a trigger and live on the local economy. And once they couldn't find jobs in 1995, 1996, 1997, many of them began to turn to gangs and began to turn to crime to sustain themselves. And as we know, Central America right now is racked with some of the highest criminal rates, certainly in the hemisphere, but even worldwide. It's a real problem that we're all wrestling with now in terms of financial support and other things to try to help resolve that issue. That developed out of the peace accords that were not necessarily fully implemented, but nonetheless, even to the extent they were implemented, did not touch all of the combatants and provide a way to make living on in the legal economy. So that's not an idle concern at all. The other issue that I would mention, you brought in Cuba into the conversation, and I think that's precisely right. It's fascinating to me how many of the people who are so quick to condemn the possibility that the United States might do anything on Venezuela as interventionism, then are precisely the same people who turn a blind eye to what Cuba has clearly been doing in Venezuela now since President Chavez was elected at the end of the last century. So that's a double standard that I wish didn't exist, but I think you're right to point it out.
If I may just add, Mr. Chairman, watching the dramatic images of repression that come through social media from Venezuela, I can't help but see the similarity in the images with the repression we saw in 2009, right after the fraudulent elections in Iran that brought Ahmadinejad to his second term. The militias that you refer to do not only benefit from training by the Cubans, but they seem to follow the model of the Basij popular militias that Iran has created as a kind of a passive defense, popular defense army in the country, which is designed specifically to countenance and put down civil opposition, organized civil opposition. In Iran, it worked very well, and part of the reason why the Iranians have advised the Chavez and then the Maduro regime on this issue is that they know how to put down a revolution because they successfully produced one in their own time. I think that highlights the problem of the external interference you have, but it should also invite some measures, well short of the kind of interventionism that America often unfairly is accused of. Namely to, again, use economic warfare against those in Iran and perhaps in other places closer to home, such as Cuba, that are dispatching military advisors, that are providing the weaponry and the financial resources to make these militias operate.
So we have about 9 minutes left before we turn into a pumpkin. So let me try to cover 3 quick topics, and they're all important. The first is, when we speak about Iran, one of the things people don't realize is that part of their statecraft is asymmetry. In essence, the asymmetrical ability to attack the United States. Both of you alluded to it in your testimony. What that means for people that may not be aware of the terminology is they're not going to try to build 10 aircraft carriers. What they are going to try to do is have cells or groups friendly and under their direction throughout the world who, in the case of conflict with the United States or the West, could conduct attacks in the homeland. Obviously, the Iranian regular army or even the Quds Force cannot transplant 10,000 fighters to come into somewhere in the United States and fight us, but they could potentially flip a switch and give the signal for groups that they've implanted in the region and throughout the world to attack us. And one of the places where we're concerned that would occur is here in the Western Hemisphere, where individuals and or cells and capacities, be it through safe houses or the like, have accumulated either weaponry or explosives or both and personnel with the capacity that at a moment of conflict could conduct attacks against the United States and or its interests in the region, potentially in the homeland, benefiting from visa-free travel to attack us. That is something we don't talk about nearly enough, but that remains a threat that we should be vigilant of, and perhaps both of you could comment on that briefly so we can, in the 8 minutes we have left, get to the other 2.
Thank you for your question. It's a very important point, and again, I'd like to refer to a case I discussed more extensively in my written statement of a recent arrest in Paraguay of a suspect Hezbollah trafficker. The individual in question was arrested a month ago. He's in custody, and in addition to being a drug trafficker, it turns out he was accredited by the local Ministry of Immigration as a mediator to facilitate applications for permanent residency and citizenship, which is fairly easy to obtain with through a small investment to begin with. The rumor from sources down there is that this individual was involved in as little as 500 and possibly many more applications throughout the years by Lebanese men, mostly, coming from South Lebanon, to reside permanently and to get involved in business locally along the frontier between Paraguay and Brazil, which is, of course, a hub for illicit finance for Hezbollah. So here is the concern. The concern is that the networks that are in place, which could help the Iranian asymmetric model you described, are actually bringing in people more and more through the lax immigration rules in South America. These people are in place, they're building infrastructure, they have, over time, they acquire citizenship, which makes it easier for them to apply for a visa and come into the United States. They're using that status they have gained already to develop money laundering networks, sometimes building companies, establishing companies here in the United States and using the financial system here, but they're also there to provide the logistical infrastructure support when Iran decides that such terrorist actions are called for. to provide the local support and network for cells that come from Iran or from Lebanon in order to carry out these attacks. So the danger is very much there, and it should require additional attention from U.S.
Just in the interest of time, because I guess I'll have to limit it to one more topic, but it's one I talked about in my opening statement, and that is Trinidad, which by far has, the largest per capita contribution to ISIS of foreign fighters of any nation in the Western Hemisphere. It's actually a startling number. 125 for a nation whose population is just a percentage, a small percentage of what ours. So the United States, you have 240 times their population, and yet they have about half as many ISIS fighters. So it's just a significant per capita. And you don't hear a lot of discussion about this, but the concern, of course, is that these individuals would return back to Trinidad and at some point are 3-hour flight away from South Florida, where I live, in my home state, but also the mainland of the United States. So I know that the risk of radicalization in Trinidad is not new. In fact, I believe it was a radicalized group that led a coup there in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken, early 90s. But how has that evolved? Is it getting enough attention beyond a couple articles? And is it your view that the Trinidad government understands the threat posed by this and is prepared to work with us to confront it?
I am not entirely familiar with the situation specific to Trinidad. I do know, however, I do see, however, the broader picture across the region, where on the one hand Iran and on the other hand radical Sunni movements, both backed by state and otherwise, are actually conducting a very aggressive drive to radicalize, to convert, and to recruit. We see the presence of radical Sunni preachers from Mexico all the way down to the Southern Cone. Equally for the Iranians, they are probably competing for recruits, but the phenomenon is very much there, is underreported, and I think that the governments in Latin America, perhaps for a lack of understanding, capacity, are not treating the problem seriously enough. There is plenty of open source evidence of radical preachers flying in from Qatar, from the Gulf, from Iran, straight into Latin America. There are direct flights now from the Gulf into Latin America. They come, they preach. There is plenty of evidence of radicalization in local mosques, and they come back. I assume that Trinidad and Tobago, the problem is the same, and because it's such a small nation with limited resources for governance, their capacity to confront this problem, even if there is political will, is limited. And so help building capacity, I think, is a key component of what U.S. policy should be.
Mr. Chairman, only two quick things, if I may. The first is to thank you again for your leadership on these issues. It's tremendously important, and it is noticed, and it's very much appreciated, so thank you. The second is, without specific reference to Trinidad, this is an issue, I think, there is an issue of cyber that if we look forward in terms of emerging potential threats for the region, and we bring in Russia and other countries like that, to the extent that there are political interests that can be manipulated in the electoral process, etc., that's something that I would encourage people to give increasing attention to, because as we go down the road, we've seen what's happened in Europe, etc. This is a potential for mischief making in Latin America to the extent people are so inclined.
And that's an interesting point, because many of these countries, unlike the United States, have centralized voting systems. People don't realize we have over 9,000 separate jurisdictions that conduct elections at the county level primarily. In many countries around the world, and certainly in the Western Hemisphere, the elections are conducted by a central entity that counts the votes for the whole country. And so you don't need to hack 9,000 or the strategic parts of the 9,000 infrastructure in terms of the United States. You can very much do it by, and that's just on the hacking front, not to mention the influence part. So, well, we appreciate both of your testimony. I apologize. We probably could, other topics we could have touched on. We've got this situation here today where the 2-hour rule has been invoked, and so that would end our hearing here at any moment now. And I don't know what happens, but I guess if we get 1 minute past, I may go to jail or something. I don't know. So at least Senate jail. But I appreciate both of your willingness to come here today and talk about this topic, because I wish it got more attention. I hope it will get more attention. As I said yesterday, and you were there, Mr. Farnsworth, and that I think in many ways the Western Hemisphere is an answer, not a problem. And hopefully we'll influence on, today we talked about some of the challenges in the region, but this committee spends also a lot of time talking about the opportunities, and I hope we'll spend more time. The record for this hearing is going to remain open for 48 hours, and you may receive a written question or so from some of the members that were not able to attend. If you can, we ask you to answer it so it can be part of our record for future consideration. With that, I thank you both and the members who came, and this hearing is adjourned.